Hey everyone, Brandon with Flyin Miata back for another FM Live, and today we're going to talk about chassis stiffness on your old Miata. Now old means a lot of different things, but today that means NA or NB Miata. And we're going to be talking specifically about what parts and what things you can do to improve the chassis stiffness. If you're looking for more of a theoretical video on it, we have a video on our channel that Keith did a couple years ago that talks about it that's really good. So go back and check that one out. So all of that having been said, as always, if you have questions, drop them in the comments. We'll try to get to them live. If we don't, we'll get to them after the fact. And if you like this kind of thing, drop a comment in there. Give us a good pat on the back and tell us we're doing a good job. Subscribe, whatever. Make sure that you stay up to date on everything. Okay, so chassis stiffness. First, what is not chassis stiffness? So we're talking about the stiffness of the chassis, the base that everything is working off of. We're not talking about stiffness of the suspension, so spring rates and shocks and sway bars. That's a different kind of stiffness, and that's not what we're talking about today. We're also, this one's maybe a little bit of a stretch, but we're also not going to talk about drivetrain stiffness. So stiffer engine mounts, stiffer diff bushings, that kind of thing. That's not the chassis, not for the purposes of today's conversation, so we're not going to talk about that. So we are talking about chassis stiffness. What is chassis stiffness and why do you want it? So you want your suspension to be able to work off of the most solid platform ever. If it could just be a solid chunk of billet steel, there are lots of drawbacks to that, but that would be great from a stiffness standpoint because there's no flex in the chassis and we don't have to account for any of that or deal with any of that. Now that's not realistic, obviously, but we want to get as close to that as we can. That's going to give the suspension the most solid platform to work off of. So we're not worrying about chassis flex in there. We're just worrying about how the suspension is deflecting in an intentional way with springs and shocks and that kind of thing. Now that is also just going to make the car feel better in kind of a subjective way. There's going to be less subjective and objective, I guess, but there's going to be less rattling. There's going to be less flexing around. You can just feel when you're driving a car, whether it's a good solid car that's not wobbling all around, or if it's a really old worn out car that is kind of everything is moving independently. That's also going to give you more predictable handling, because the car is going to do the same thing, whether it's generally speaking or closer to, whether it's on a perfectly smooth road or whether it's on a bumpy road, because your wheel is able to, if you have good suspension with enough wheel travel, key parts, but that's not what we're talking about today. But that's going to make it so that the suspension can do its job in a corner and we're not having to worry about how much the chassis is flexing and deflecting and doing new and unexpected things. Now, as you get more into the performance end of things, this is going to be more important. If you have stiffer springs and sway bars, then that's going to put more load into the chassis, and it's going to basically try to make that chassis deflect more, which is what we don't want it to do. So the harder you're driving the car, the stiffer your suspension is, the more you'll benefit from a stiffer chassis. So why is this especially important on an NA and NB? Well, they're old. As much as it might pain some of us to say that, since we've been working on NAs and NBs for a very long time, they're not new cars. So there are a few different ways to look at that. They're old as in old technology. So when these cars were developed, they didn't have quite the computer processing power and that kind of thing to make the chassis as stiff as possible. They had a lot of things that they did. They did a good job on it, but a modern car that's developed with modern technology, for all that that means, is going to be stiffer, or should better be stiffer to start off with for that reason. Also, mileage. Hopefully, and I mean, hey, to each their own, but hopefully you drive your Miata a lot. That's the whole idea, right? And if it has, the more miles it has on it, the more things are just going to kind of loosen up over time. So that's another reason that you need more chassis stiffness in there. Now it's also made to be light, and Mazda did a really good job of making it light economically and as stiff as possible but if we're willing to spend some money, we can make it that much better. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there's nothing here. It's a convertible. It also has a giant hole through the middle of it. So really the only thing tying the front half and the back half of the car together are your door sills, and there's quite a bit of structure in here, and then the transmission tunnel here. So otherwise it's basically a giant hole, which is awesome because convertibles are awesome, but they're not very structural. So we have to kind of make up for that as much as we can. And then also a kind of very specific thing, 65-mile-an-hour shimmy, particularly on NAs, probably not quite so much on NBs. That's typically because of bad tires or bad balance and, in the wheels, that type of thing. So that's job number one, to fix that. But if you increase the stiffness of your chassis, it's going to change the resonant frequency, and it's going to make it less likely for that to happen, or at least make it happen if you don't fix your wheels and tires at a different point where you're less likely to spend time in. So what can we do? So we're going to just start at the front of the car and work to the back because that's what worked best for my brain. So one of the easiest and least expensive things you can do is a shock tower brace. So this is a double wishbone car, so your cornering loads are going in here, which is why maybe this isn't super important. However, you still have vertical loads coming in here as the car goes over bumps, hits bumps. So tying those two towers together can really do a good job of stiffening up the front end of the car, making the steering that much sharper, and making it, again, less rattly, it makes it feel a little bit less like it's falling apart. As with most things, be sure you're buying a good shock tower brace. There are plenty of them out there on the market that are cheap and maybe they look cool, but they're not designed intelligently. They're not strong in the ways that they need to be strong. They have pivot points that kind of sort of defeat the purpose of them, that kind of thing. Now, Mazda knows how important shock tower braces are, so from 99 on, the higher trim levels, the sportier trim levels of Miatas came with shock tower braces. Now ours right here, all stainless steel, easy bolt on, obviously intelligently designed, so very, very stiff, works really well, and not very expensive either. If you have a stock shock tower brace and it's not a 99 or 2000, that's probably about as functional as this. This one's sexier. You should buy ours for that reason. But from a functionality standpoint, honestly, the 01 to 05 shock tower brace is really pretty good. So for an earlier NB, that could be if you find one cheap, sweet, that's a nice upgrade. For the 99 to 2000, there's a bolt that goes this way, and you'll notice that our shock tower brace has two. That one bolt means that now the tower and the bar can pivot, so it defeats, it lessens the effectiveness of the brace. If you have a 99 to 2000, this would be an upgrade, functionally and aesthetically. If you have an 01 to 05, this would be an aesthetic upgrade, but probably not really a functional upgrade because they are quite good to start off with. So moving to the back of the, moving more towards the rear of the car, you'll have to imagine it here, but we'll show you one out of the car in a minute. We have our strong arms. So basically they go from about here down here, and they tie this piece. It's very similar to what this is doing. It's basically stiffening up this part of the car and making it less likely for the whole front end of the frame of the unibody to deflect in this direction. You do have to remove the fender, but outside of that, it's a pretty easy bolt-on. You can see it right here. So this is it. It bolts onto the door hinges right here, another point right here, and also right here, and over here. So a bunch of different points of contact. You can see it has a three-dimensional shape to it, so it's a very strong and rigid design. There are others on the market. They're probably cheaper. They're sure built cheaper, just price points and whatever else. But this is going to be, I think, by a significant margin, the most effective one on the market. It also goes a little bit farther forward, to my knowledge, than most of them. So more comprehensive. It picks up more points there. So that's from our friends at Paco Motorsports. Okay, so another good one, we're going to go over to the car that's in the air, is the frame rails. So your stock Miata has frame rails already underneath here that you may or may not be able to see, but trust me. That is on purpose. That's a good boxed section that ties the two halves of the car together, like we talked about earlier. This is basically reinforcing that. So if your frame rails are perfect, then these will make a decent difference in stiffening the whole structure because it's just more rigid than the stock ones. If your frame rails have been crushed, which does describe quite a few at this point, then it's going to make a huge difference, because if this shape is no longer a box and it has a big dip in the middle of it, a lot of that structural integrity goes away, and now the chassis is going to flex around that. So putting this frame rail on there is going to make a huge difference to that. The next step is our butterfly brace here. So this is going to, with the transmission tunnel, it does a good job relatively of keeping the car strong this way, but it doesn't do anything this way. You know, this has a big open hole in it, so the two sides of the car can kind of flex up and away like this. The butterfly brace is going to hold those two sides together, so when it tries to do this, it's pulling this in tension and it can't. So that makes a huge difference to the rigidity of the chassis. Now that's another thing that Mazda knows, because let's see, I believe from 01 and on, they have different versions of, and different trim packages and all that fun stuff, but basically different versions of this same kind of idea that's going to tie the two halves together. This, as you would imagine, is quite a bit stronger than any of the factory stuff. So it's kind of the same thing as I was saying with the shock tower brace. If you have an 01 to 05, you already have stuff here. This is better, but you already have something. If you have a 1990, that was the flimsiest Miata that Mazda has made. So that is going to be it's going to be a really big benefit on an 05. It's going to be a gigantic benefit on a 1990, because again, flimsiest to start off with. And stay tuned. We have more, not chassis stiffness, but fun products related to the butterfly brace coming, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, so let's see. Moving towards the back of the car, we have our cheapest and easiest stiffening upgrade, which is our door bushings. Now, I did a video on these a little while ago, so I'm not going to go too far into detail on it, but these are the new versions. They're injection molded. They come in fun colors. They're also half the price of the old ones. But the idea here is that this piece that is now rigid instead of rubber interfaces with this metal cup right here, and it makes it so that the door is more of an integral part of the chassis. So if you imagine this with your doors open, there's a giant hole through there, right? So again, the car is trying to do this. If now we put that in there that's rigid, we close the door, nice solid thunk that is also indicative of those door bushings. Now the door is more of a structural part of that. So it's trying to flex that junction right there, and since that's rigid, it's not going to be able to flex as much. Now, no, door bushing is not going to make as big of a difference as a butterfly brace, but it's also dramatically easier and less expensive to install. So pros and cons. Roll bars. So a roll bar's primary function is to keep the pavement off of your head. No one likes that. It's not a good time. But they also do have a secondary benefit of really stiffening up the chassis. Now, there's quite a bit of structure right here, which, sidebar, is why we don't sell a rear shock tower brace, because they're pretty jewelry and not tremendously effective, because that's already a pretty stiff part of the chassis. But the roll bar does help stiffen everything up and tie the seatbelt towers together. Again, just makes it flex a little bit less. Hardtops are another good one. Again, not the primary purpose, but tying this point to this point to this point, maybe this one's slightly less because there's rubber in there, and basically enclosing all of this does help, certainly with the perceived rigidity of the car. Again, you're closing in this giant hole here. Now, there's slop in all of those joints. It's not turning it into a hardtop car, but it is kind of going in that direction. So that does help a fair amount as well. Now, a roll cage is going to be even more effective because that really is making it into a coupe type car. It's really putting a lot of structure between here and there. You lots of times will have side impact protection, so there's a lot there. So that can make a gigantic difference to how stiff the chassis is. Obviously, there are significant drawbacks and not plausible or recommended for a street car. So that's a thing that can be very beneficial, also not realistic for most of us.
Why don't we do a rear shock tower brace?
I did touch on that briefly.
My apologies.
That's okay, but I can talk about it again. So there are, well, I don't think we have enough of the parts pulled out of this car to show, but basically for a rear, yeah, that's pointless. You'll be able to see a spare tire and the metal panel that covers the shock tower over there. But basically, same thing in the front. There's a shock tower here, there's a shock tower here. There are products out there that connect those two and do the same kind of thing, theoretically, as the front shock tower brace. If you look at the front of the car, there's a giant hole because we have to have engines. We like engines, they're good things. So that means there's a giant hole in the middle of everything and we have to tie those two pieces together to make them structurally rigid. There's a lot of metal and a lot of two-dimensional metal back here that's gonna add quite a bit of rigidity to the car to start off with. So they're pretty. If you wanna do them, sweet, more power to you. Don't expect a big difference in chassis stiffness by doing that. Next, we have a Canon subframe brace. So this is applicable to all 90 to 05 Miatas with a pretty big asterisk, which I will get to. So what it does is tie together this part that you can't see because the diffuser is on here. We did poor planning here. So if we look at it from this side, Travis, I can still kind of talk about it. So it goes on the back side of the subframe here. Since we can't see that, we're gonna pretend like it's the front side here. So where your control arms tie in to the subframe, it ties basically, it encloses this big U here. So your cornering loads, your braking loads and such are gonna go into here and they're gonna try to make them basically walk around, and we don't want that to happen. So the Canon brace ties all those together, which is great. Pretty easy install, so on and so forth. When you might not want it is on a 94 or later. So what we also have is this ladder brace right here. So, excuse me, depending on the year of car, you might only have a tube that goes here. You might have a ladder or I guess kind of a U brace that goes like this. You might have a ladder brace that has bracing that goes across it, but basically your car already has bracing that is doing the same thing as the Canon brace. Doesn't look as cool, but it kind of goes back to the aesthetics versus function type of thing. So this bar is gonna effectively do the same thing as the Canon brace. This is gonna tie the rear of the subframe to the front of the subframe and then also to the chassis of the car. So that's going to stiffen things up quite a bit there. Depending on the year of your car, you may be able to bolt the Canon brace straight to it, even though you have these parts, or you might have to modify it. But again, it's not a hugely beneficial thing if you already have this piece on there. So hopefully you guys can see what it looks like installed in the proper orientation. There are some free and cheap things with a big asterisk that you can do. Seam welding is a good one. You can, and we have, check out help.flyinmiata.com. We've got a good knowledge base article on it there for specifics, but basically what it is, this is a unibody car, right? It's all formed sheet metal effectively. So you've got two pieces that are laid on top of each other and they have stitch welds, spot welds in between those two pieces holding them together. So they can still kind of flex a little bit. Well, if you weld that seam, now they're rigid. And if you weld the right seams, then you can really make a pretty big difference to the overall rigidity of the car. That one's free, effectively. Welding wire is cheap. Getting to those places might be a little more difficult, so free deserves a big asterisk in there. But basically, there are places in here where you would weld. There are places in here, particularly around the shock towers, all the way around this opening, because this is where there are many layers of sheet metal that come together, and they're just kind of going to do this. And if we weld that, now it's a rigid joint. And there's more in here. Another one that I've done to my personal car that's even more involved is putting some of the NB gussets onto an NA chassis. So as the car progressed, as the Miata progressed in its lifespan, particularly the NA and the NB, which are basically the same car with some different details, Mazda did a number of upgrades, particularly on the NB2. One of the big ones is they basically made it so the transmission tunnel, which again is one of the major components that's keeping the car from trying to fold in on itself like that, they really stiffened up a lot of those junctions. So on an NA right back here where the transmission tunnel hits the bulkhead, there's, and you can't see it without the parts removed, but right in here, there's just a tiny little sheet metal thing. It's about that wide, it's about that long, and it, you know, stiffens it a little bit. For an NB2, it's this big comprehensive piece that is thicker gauge. It comes out a little farther this way, a little bit farther this way. It wraps all the way around the transmission tunnel. So this is getting weedy, but hey, if you have a salvage yard and a welder, you can take that and weld it, remove your stock one, weld it in there, and that's going to really increase the stiffness between the tunnel and the bulkhead. Heads up, your center console will not work unless you kind of go to town on that as well. It's not too bad, but it's not going to bolt back in. Same kind of thing up here between where the transmission tunnel hits the firewall. The NA has little gussets in the corners. The NB has much bigger gussets, heavier gauge. They wrap around more, they're stronger, that kind of thing. So that does make a pretty big difference there. Very cheap because salvage cars and stuff that's just going to get thrown away. Very not cheap because it's extremely high effort. Okay, I'm sure that's not the complete list, but that is my complete list. So we will stop there and we will look for questions. And I see somebody flailing around right now. So what do you have for us? Do any of these bracing options affect crash safety? Also, let me back up. If you have questions, now's the time. Drop them in the comments. We will get to them. I do not think so, and not in a bad way, but we are not crash testing this stuff, to be clear. So let me give you a couple of examples. For my understanding, in 94, can't remember, but Mazda attached this seatbelt tower to that seatbelt tower. And my understanding is that that was not done for chassis stiffness, it was done for crash protection. So that if you get into a side crash here, it's going to take some of the load that's trying to fold this in and it's going to distribute it to that side so that basically we're making stuff up. But let's say that both sides move in 6 inches instead of one side moving in a foot. So it's going to distribute load better. The shock tower brace, do not buy it for crash protection, please. But from a theoretical standpoint, it could do something like that as well. Now, the strong arms, the whole front of the car is crash structure and it's supposed to fold in, and we are stiffening that part. Now, we're not stiffening anything from here forward, so the majority of the impact is still intact, or the impact structure is still intact. And I don't know, you know, a crash test engineer probably, or would definitely have smarter things to say than me, but making this part of it stronger might make it less likely to have a cabin intrusion, maybe. The short version is do not buy any of this stuff to improve the crash safetiness of, or effectiveness, whatever, of the car. But some of it could actually be beneficial and this should not be detrimental. I am not a crash test engineer. Do not sue me if that is not correct. Yes. So we tried an expanding foam on one of our cars, Pokey, if memory serves, to improve the stiffness of the chassis. I did not have a bunch of experience with that. I will say the car actually did feel pretty good. It felt stiff and solid, more so, and that was a 95, more so than most 95s, including my personal 96. So probably effective. There is some logic in there. There are lots of voids within all of the sheet metal. There are lots of layers of metal. If you ever cut the side sill of one of these open, it's pretty interesting in there. But that should make some kind of a difference. How much of a difference? I don't have a clue, but it should make some kind of a difference. Okay, all right. Well, I have some questions ahead of time. If you have questions, drop them in the comments. Yell at Mike, whatever floats your boat. Okay, so are frame rails really a simple bolt-on? I am put off because you have to drill holes in the car to install them. Are there options that use existing holes to create similar results? Are they really a simple bolt-on? Absolutely, they just bolt on after you drill holes. So yes, there is a qualifier in there. Drilling the holes is not a big deal. The frame rail itself acts as a template. You have to take the seats out, which is a 30-second operation. Pull the carpet back, which is not that big of a deal. And then you're gonna push the frame rail up into place. It's a bit of a press fit, not bad, depending on the condition of your frame rails. But anyway, so point being, it'll hold itself in place. You wanna make sure that you carefully locate it per the instructions. And actually the new version kind of locates itself a little bit as well. And then you drill holes. That's not a big deal to me. Maybe it's a big deal to you. Now, other options that will do the same thing. You could install the frame rails and weld them on instead of bolting them on. Don't think that's good, pointing in the right direction that you think or that you're intending. Now, these are mostly keeping the car from folding like this. So if we look at it from that standpoint, the door bushings are going to help with that. Not to anywhere near the degree of the frame rails, but it is trying to solve the same kind of thing. Hard Dog does sell a door bar that kind of bolts in to where the roll bar bolts in down here and kind of runs up here and then into the footwell. So that should make a pretty big difference in the same kind of thing. You have to drill holes. So I suppose that's not actually solving that problem. That one makes me a little nervous for crash intrusion and such, because there's a bar here and it's awkward to step in and out of. And if you get hit in the side, it might be another thing that's going to fold over, or it might be a thing that's going to keep from intrusion in the cockpit. So maybe, but again, you've got to drill holes for that as well. Fewer holes at least. Hardtop, actually. A hardtop is probably going to be the easiest option that legitimately does not have to be bolted in, because the frame rails are dealing with folding the car in this way. By attaching here and here and here to each other, we're also keeping the car from folding in together. So that would be my actual answer there. Okay, will the newer V2 frame rails and butterfly brace line up with the holes I already have from your V1 frame rails, or will I need to drill new holes in order to upgrade? So as long as, well, let me kind of start at the unasked question, but at the beginning. If you have V1 frame rails, they will not, unfortunately, work with the V2 butterfly brace. If you have a welder and more time than sense, it will. It's doable. It's more complicated than it's worth just buying a new set of frame rails. Now for your specific question of bolt holes, let's look underneath here. So from the very beginning to now, we have been using the same bolt holes, so it will bolt up with one qualifier. We did add additional holes for more stiffness, and we did, and this is splitting hairs a little bit, but we did tighten up the holes on the butterfly brace, again, for more stiffness. So if you have old frame rails and you upgrade to our new complete butterfly kit with the new frame rails, it will bolt into place. It will use your existing bolt holes. You might have to drill additional new holes, but you won't have to drill any new holes, or sorry, you won't have any unoccupied holes from your original frame rails with your new frame rails. Hopefully that answers the question. Are there any chassis bracing options for the NC? So yes, the NC is a much more rigid chassis to start off with. So it's a little less in dire need of options like that. It also has a lot of the stuff that I talked about. It has a kind of version of a butterfly brace just to tie the two halves, the two sides of the tunnel together. Some of the trim packages have a shock tower brace in there already. So again, more stiff is more better for your chassis, but the NC needs it a little less. That said, yes, there are options. We have some Motorsports braces that replace the stock braces with just a stiffer option. So it's not going from no bracing to some bracing, it's going from okay bracing to really good bracing. So, and there are options like that, but it's a lot better to start off with, so it's less of a crucial thing with the NC. Okay, so basically, what did you say about outweighing? Can the weight of, or the stiffness benefit of a brace outweigh the weight penalty of said brace? That is going to be a very subjective thing. In terms, basically, it's going to be a subjective thing. In terms of lap times, maybe you would need some testing on that. In terms of seat of the pants, as long as you're not going crazy with it, yes, I think it would for me personally. I have a butterfly brace and the strong arms and the shock tower brace and a roll bar on my car, and the, what is that, maybe 100 pounds in total? Totally worth it to me. Now, if you want a more in-depth answer on that, go check out that video I mentioned earlier where Keith talks about kind of more of the theory of chassis stiffness. But again, for my 2 cents, for like a performance street car and for a track car as well, I would say that it is worth the penalty. Okay, is there an easy way to reshape a crushed factory frame rail? So there are a lot of options. You can use a sledgehammer, you can cut them off. The best but scariest option that I've heard, not our fault if you hurt yourself doing this, but I had a customer say that they took a bench vise, put it on their floor jack, lifted it up into place, and used that to squeeze it in. That actually makes a lot of sense. Please do not let that vise fall down on you or any of your fragile parts. That would be unpleasant. But it is actually a pretty effective thing to do when done carefully. Lots of times people just take a sledgehammer to it. You just need to get it to, you need to get it within that envelope defined by the replacement frame rails so that you can slip it over, because the new frame rails are going to provide that structure to that you are losing by those deformed frame rails. So hopefully that answers that question. Here's a good one that I can't really answer. What are the signs that my aging chassis needs these improvements? So that's kind of like, how do I know when I need new shocks? There are some very dramatic indications of when you need new shocks, but lots of times when your shocks fail gradually and the ride doesn't drop off a cliff, it kind of rolls down a hill. And it's slow enough that you don't really notice the changes, and then you get in your friend's car or your friend drives your car and you're like, why is this thing not working right? I would say it's that same kind of thing. I would say that if, the safe answer is to do it because there's a pretty high likelihood that you need them. But if you can find a low mileage car to drive, if you can find a friend's car that has a bunch of these chassis upgrades to it, does it feel better than yours? Now, obviously, there are other qualifiers in there, what kind of suspension, tires, bushings, all that kind of stuff. So there are a lot of layers in there. But it's going to be the kind of thing that's hard to say, when my car does X, I need to install Y. It's more of a seat of the pants kind of thing, if that makes sense. So best bang for the buck upgrade is going to be the butterfly brace.
And frame rails.
And frame rails, yeah. Yeah, that's a pretty clear cut in my opinion. That makes a huge difference. And from the feedback we've received, apparently it's not just me, a lot of customers think the same thing. I think actually with our version 1 frame rails, Keith's wife pulled it out of the driveway and said, "What did you do to this car? It's no longer wobbling all over the place," with zero prompting or indication that anything had changed outside of that behavior. So, okay, which area on the chassis will have the greatest effect on rigidity when seam welded? The area that is easiest for you to access. If you have the whole car apart, do it all. You're in there. If you don't, do what you can get access to. That said, the door openings are going to be really easy to access and probably should be extremely effective. You can also take the wheels off, weld in the shock towers there. Anything in the engine bay will be effective, but will be much higher effort to get to. If you're doing that, heads up, there is seam sealer and paint and all sorts of gross down within that. So yeah, it's going to take you a while. It's a high effort kind of thing to clean out all that stuff, and then you won't get it out all out anyway, and your welds will still be kind of gross, but a lot better than not having them. So that is what I would say there. Okay, so is the added weight from bracing worth it? We already talked about that. Are there chassis upgrades that will help with interior rattles? Yes, all of them, basically. Anything that you can do to stiffen the chassis and to make it less likely to just kind of wobble around is going to decrease the likelihood of rattles. Now, this is not a Rolls Royce. Do not expect it to magically make it completely rattle-free. Nary a squeak emerges from the chassis. We're just trying to make it better and take those big chunks off to make it less likely to rattle, as opposed to no rattling whatsoever. So, Mike, do we have more? You're over there typing furiously. Are there more? Are there more questions? Oh, I'm good, Ethan. Thank you for asking. I appreciate it. I hope you're well too. Okay, awesome. Okay, so that covers it. Hopefully this was helpful. Really, the short version is anything intelligent that you can do to increase the stiffness of the chassis is a good thing, and I would absolutely recommend doing it. Again, if you like this stuff, subscribe. So we have these videos every week and all sorts of other fun stuff in between as well. If you come up with a question afterwards, drop it in the comments or reach out to our customer support team. We'll get it answered for you. Hopefully you liked it. We'll see you next week.